In the early morning hours on May 16, 2021, in Tempe, Arizona, police officers entered an apartment. They noticed a large pool of blood near a bedroom were trash and boxes, random items thrown about, a blanket, and a mattress. They lifted the mattress and began to rummage through the pile, which is when they discovered two small bodies underneath. Who were these innocent victims, and who was the monster who tried to hide their remains? Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. This is a special warning for those of you who are particularly sensitive to crimes against children. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. At 12:30 a.m. on May 15, 2021, in Tempe, Arizona, law enforcement officers responded to a call from a man who reported the woman he had recently divorced was behaving violently and acting erratically. The man, samhsa Inoue, said that his ex-wife had hacked to pieces his computer and other electronics in the house. She was screaming at him, wielding a large kitchen knife, and had threatened to stab him. When the police arrived, they did not believe there was any real cause for concern. There was minimal damage done, and no one had been physically harmed. Police officers left the house after being reassured that their two kids were fine and asleep in their beds. The husband later said that he left the residence around 3 a.m. There is no known exact time of the following sequence of events. After the police had left Yui Inoue alone, she went into her children's bedroom with a meat cleaver. She dragged her children down to the floor and firmly held them down. Yui Inoue raised the knife and struck her son and daughter dozens of times with the blade. She was now covered in her children's blood. Yui Inoue removed her clothing and placed it inside a garbage bag. Then she took a bath. Afterwards, she packed a backpack, which contained her passport, cash, and jewelry. Then she locked the front door and left her apartment. Around 7:30 a.m., Yui Inoue drove to a Tempe police substation and flagged down officers, speaking to them primarily in Japanese. Yui Inoue informed an officer that she was hearing voices telling her to kill her children. Police observed bloodstains on her heel, superficial cuts along her fingers, and that her hands and knees were bruised. Law enforcement officers returned to the residence around 8 a.m. Inside, they were met with the most horrifying and traumatizing crime scene an investigator can face: the brutal slaying of two small kids. When police entered the apartment, they noticed a pile of trash and boxes, random items thrown about, and a mattress. They lifted the mattress and began to rummage through the pile, which is when they discovered two small bodies hidden underneath. The woman's son and daughter, 9-year-old Mia and 7-year-old Kai, had been hacked to death with some kind of vicious, bladed weapon. The two small children had countless lacerations, cuts, and amputations. There were also multiple defensive wounds on them. The children had been almost completely decapitated. The scene was too much for investigators to process. It was too much darkness for anyone to grasp. autopsy reports could not quantify exactly how many times the children were struck with the meat cleaver. It was estimated to be dozens of times, and the unforgiving knife wielded against these helpless small children had even amputated pieces of their bodies. The coroner's official cause of death for each child was sharp force and multiple chopping injuries. Their mother, Yui Inoue, was promptly arrested on suspicion of murder. When she was detained, investigators saw the blood and lacerations on her body. During her interrogation, Yui Inoue told homicide investigators that she had gone to bed with her kids that night. She woke up around 4:30 a.m. to a bloody and unbelievable scene. Her hands and arms were covered in blood. Then she saw, lying near the doorway, her 2 children, dead and bloodied. But she claimed to have no recollection of harming them. She told police how it wasn't until after her bath that she became awoken of what she had done, but that she didn't believe she had killed them. Investigators would search her vehicle and find her blood-soaked clothes and the weapon, a blood-covered meat cleaver with a 6-inch blade, inside a bag. The suspect also had suitcases inside the car, which were spattered with blood. The investigation later revealed how the couple had recently divorced, and Yui Inoue had planned to return to her native homeland of Japan. However, money was tight, and finances became the center of hostility between the man and his former wife. On the night of the murders, the former husband, Tsubasa Inoue, and his wife, Yui Inoue, were fighting about the money needed for her to relocate to Japan. The conflict escalated, and Yui Inoue grabbed the meat cleaver from the kitchen and began swinging it around, attacking his computer and other items before threatening to stab her ex-husband. The man reported this incident to the police, and he claimed that he slept in his vehicle that night in the parking lot of the bank where he worked. Except for the incident of domestic abuse the night of the murders, there were no previous signs of violence exhibited by the mother or any sounds heard from the apartment at all. According to one of their next-door neighbors at the apartment complex, Kevin Hofstadter, he didn't know them very well and they hadn't lived there very long. But he said that the couple never made any noise. He wasn't even aware they had children. So he was especially startled when he heard through their shared wall a sudden outburst, a pounding. It lasted around 8 consecutive minutes. Then all sound stopped for about 5 minutes until the pounding began again. But this time it was much softer. This information he shared with the police, and the same details were confirmed by a neighbor who lived beneath them. The DCS, or Department of Children's Services, at the time of the children's deaths, were investigating the mother for alleged neglect. She had recently taken off with her youngest son, Kai, before the police located her and the boy hiding behind a convenience store. Yui Inoue was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and her son Kai was returned to his father. DCS argued there was no evidence of neglect or abuse. Both children said they felt safe with their parents. From what they saw and heard, there was no viable reason to remove the kids from the home that night, even though the investigation was still open when the children were killed. On May 15, 2021, Yui Inoue, 40, was officially indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of child abuse, and disorderly conduct. Yui Inoue was held in Maricopa County Jail on a $2 million bond. On July 7, 2021, the state put forth the argument of aggravating circumstances in the death of her 2 children. This same day, Yui Inoue would be appointed a Japanese-speaking interpreter. There was no denying that since English was not her native language, Yui Inoue had many challenges communicating her story with the police and later understanding the legal process. At her first official hearing through her Japanese-speaking interpreter, she said that she didn't kill anybody. On September 12, 2021, Yui Inoue filed a Defendant's Rule 12.9 motion. This is a legal motion in which a defendant in a criminal case challenges a grand jury proceeding. It is a process to argue that the grand jury proceeding was flawed somehow, which may have led to an invalid indictment. I could not locate any specific reason why the defense counsel argued this point, but it may have simply been a legal strategy to delay the pretrial hearings further. On March 2, 2022, a motion for the appointment of a mental health expert witness, along with a request to transport the defendant to a clinic for psychiatric assessment, was filed. Everyone involved in the investigation, in particular homicide investigators, believed that the mother was severely mentally ill. She initially had told police that voices had commanded her to kill her children, but during her court hearing she would say that her kids were still alive. Yui Inoue would later claim that her children were not dead, and she couldn't understand why people were saying that she had killed them. According to her interpreter, she said they were spending time with her parents in Japan, that she loved her kids dearly, and that it was very odd that everyone was saying they were dead. Yui Inoue was given multiple psychiatric assessments, but they would not help in her defense. On September 29, 2023, more than a year and a half later, Yui Inoue was declared to be competent to stand trial. Further, the judge prohibited anything mental health related from being addressed during her trial. The criminal trial of Yui Inoue began in February 2025 and lasted around 2 weeks. Maricopa County Prosecutor Shaylee Beasley painted Yui Inoue as a monster of a mother who expressed zero remorse over having slain her 2 small children. She told the jury the story like this. Mia and Kai Inoue were sleeping soundly in their beds when their own mother came into their bedroom holding a knife. A meat cleaver that is literally designed to cut the bones of animals. And she attacked them with it. She had to think, she had to act, and there's nothing unclear or speculative about any of that. During the criminal trial, the prosecution addressed the trauma that these murders had caused for all involved, including the state, the defense, the investigators, the coroner, and crime scene specialists. Many of them had to undergo counseling because of what they were exposed to. Mia and Kai's uncle told the courtroom how their loss has severely affected their entire family. Their former elementary school principal, Tammy Thate, read a victim impact statement, choking back tears. And I quote, "Their absence from our school community has been felt every day since their death. We miss their warm and welcoming smiles. We miss their gentle spirits. We miss their infectious giggles. Although they were both children, I want this court to know their short lives mattered." Rebecca Felmley, her defense attorney, discussed Yui Inoue's suffering mental state and addressed how she was involuntarily evaluated twice in the months before her children were killed. Yui Inoue's defense did their best to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, pointing out how there were no eyewitnesses to the children's murders and that Yui Inoue, who was a small woman, was not physically strong enough to carry out the crime. The medical examiner testified regarding the extreme amount of force that would be necessary to inflict such severe injuries. He stated that it would require a significant amount of strength and energy over an extended period to cause the wounds with the meat cleaver, describing it as equivalent to the amount of force from a guillotine. Their client also had no memory of committing these murders. She asked the jury, why would my client go to the police station wearing the blood of her kids with the weapon in the vehicle if she was the one who had killed them? But nothing could be said about the defendant, Yui Inoue, to wipe away the graphic images and horrifying descriptions of two small innocent children brutally slain. The jury would quickly return with a verdict. They found Yui Inoue guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of child abuse, and 1 count of disorderly conduct. The state asked that the judge sentence the defendant to consecutive life sentences for her crimes. The prosecutor spoke the following within her memorandum. The children were helpless, sleeping, and completely at the mercy of their own mother, who showed none. These deaths were physically painful and emotionally torturous. The first responders, detectives, crime scene specialists, and medical examiner are permanently traumatized by the injuries inflicted on these children. The children's friends, school teachers, and Tempe community are harmed by such a horrific event. There is no mitigation that warrants anything less than consecutive presumptive terms for these crimes. On May 2nd, 2025, a little more than 4 years after the murders of her 2 children, the convicted mother faced the judge for her punishment. Before handing down her penalty, Judge Jeffrey Reuter said to the courtroom, "I can't imagine what those children went through in their last minutes. The fear, the suffering. It's incomprehensible." He later spoke to the media about how it was the hardest case he has ever dealt with, over 2 decades being a judge. He sentenced Yui Inoue to 2 life terms, 1 for each child she killed, and an additional 35 years for the counts of child abuse and disorderly conduct to be served consecutively to her life sentences. This case is beyond tragic. It is horrible and heartbreaking, and there are no words that can properly describe the crimes committed against these children. The question remains, what was this mother's motive? What triggered her to kill her innocent children, and could this crime have been prevented? First, it is necessary to view this offender and her crimes through the specific type of homicide she committed: filicide. Specifically, maternal filicide. Children are most at risk of being killed by their parents. This is not a modern-day phenomenon, nor is the crime limited to one country, race, or ethnicity. In the last quarter of the 20th century, 61% of children under 5 years old were murdered by their parents. 61%. Of these murders, 30% were committed by their mothers and 31% by their fathers. As mentioned in a previous episode, the United States has the highest rate of child homicide when compared with other developed nations. The child homicide rate for infants is 8 out of 100,000, 2.5 for preschool-aged kids, and 1.5 for school-aged children, described as being between 5 and 14 years old. Based on the 1973 classification system established by forensic psychiatrist P.D. Scott regarding paternal filicide, psychiatrist D'Orban created her own for maternal filicide. The 6 categories include battering mothers, mentally ill mothers, neonaticides, retaliating women, unwanted children, and mercy killings. There are specific patterns of maternal filicide that are important to note. Almost all cases have occurred at home. In most incidents, the mother has killed more than one child. In half of the cases, the mother had an upsetting conversation or altercation with the husband before committing the act. A history of violence by the offenders of maternal filicide does not seem to correlate with the act of filicide, although many have been young, poor, undereducated, and were the children's primary caregivers. Depression and experiencing hallucinations has been found to be a commonly shared trait amongst these perpetrators. Motherly love, the ultimate protection and security a child is supposed to be able to depend on. The one who nurtures you, tends to your wounds, and loves you beyond her own life, something that many of us have experienced, but some women regret and resent this label, this expectation placed upon them by society, by the patriarchal forces that perceive females as being meant to be mothers and caregivers. The data and historical records show us that women have rejected and violently rebelled against the notion of motherhood for centuries. Unfortunately and tragically, some women have elected to murder their children as a result. The structure of motherhood and women's status within society is an overarching theme across all cases of filicide. In almost every incident of maternal filicide, the act is committed by a mother who, for one reason or another, is faced with circumstances that deny her to parent her children. Psychologists Meyer and Oberman have provided a very interesting perspective on the act of filicide. Two female psychologists who have reviewed hundreds of cases have noticed patterns that have led them to establish a typology unique from the others. They believe that this crime is triggered not just from mental illness, but rather from the intersection of society, environment, culture, and of course, variables that are distinct to the individual's life experience. Their categories include filicide related to an ignored state of pregnancy, abuse-related filicide, filicide due to neglect, assisted or coerced filicide, and purposeful filicide. For mothers whose cases have fallen under purposeful or intentional filicide, they have all been considered mentally ill. If a woman is suffering from severe depression and/or psychosis, how is it possible that she meet the needs and demands of taking care of young children? The role of mental illness thus falls into place for the primary reason behind why and how a woman could kill her kids. Yet, little research exists within this realm of family murder, and what does? The methodology and sample size and selection tend to be very narrow to generate any helpful conclusions that can help lead to real prevention. The average perpetrator of maternal filicide is early 20s to 30s, uneducated, unemployed outside the home, lower to middle class, and are socially isolated. Since this describes a large population of mothers, how is anyone supposed to identify signs or characteristics that a mother may be capable of child homicide? Psychiatric diagnoses are too often made after the murders have already been committed. Some research has suggested that the evidence of mental illness may be a direct result of the PTSD and depression caused by the act of filicide and didn't necessarily exist during the time of the offense. However, there are way too many cases similar to Yui Inoue's where there are very clear warning signs of psychosis and impending violence. Prosecutors believed that Yui Inoue was triggered after her ex-husband had called the police over to intervene on the night of the children's murders. She wanted revenge against him for contacting them and wanted him to pay in the worst imaginable way by murdering his kids. She had already planned to return to Japan. There is no record as to whether she intended to bring the children with her or if that was an additional point of tension and hostility between the former spouses. It was suggested and illustrated by the prosecution during her criminal trial that her main motivation was to get back at her husband. This mother of 2 young kids wanted revenge against her ex for divorcing her and for not having enough money for her to comfortably return to Japan. His calling the police over to their apartment the night of the murders was the last straw. Spousal revenge as the primary motivator of filicide is one of the rarest forms. As defined by the offender seeking retaliation against their partner by killing one or more of their children, the individual is motivated by the desire to make that person suffer. This desire has been written about as early as the play from 431 BC, which referenced its act. In the play, what is known as the Medea syndrome is discussed. Euripides tells the story of a woman, Medea, who kills her 2 sons in an act of revenge upon her husband. Although it does exist, apparently has since this time in history, research shows it only occurs in around 2% of maternal filicide, with his presence much more common when committed by the father. According to a specialist in this field, Resnick, there have been 2 characteristics of women who commit this type of maternal filicide. They have borderline personality and dependent personality disorders, when their crimes fall under the realm of retaliation. The brutal depravity and sheer rage Yui Inoue exhibited toward her innocent children does indicate some elements of a revenge killing. Her actions were so beyond anything comprehensible for anyone, much less a mother, to do. It is difficult to believe that their deaths were premeditated and caused by anger around her divorce, but maybe she was one of the rare perpetrators of this kind of maternal filicide. Her actions, nevertheless, also showed signs of delusion and psychosis. Why would she have driven to the police and told them about the voices telling her to kill her children when she could have simply driven to the airport and left the country? That doesn't sound like a smart, cold, calculated killer to me. Our society continues to insist that mental illness is the primary reason behind any woman who kills her kids, because such a horrific act goes against the grain of everything we believe in. It shatters the pillar of what civilization is built on. We can't comprehend that a woman would willingly end the lives of innocent children who are literally a part of her flesh. Such a woman must be mad, insane, sick, and twisted. The act has to be beyond her self-will and control. It must be her mental illness telling her to brutally and savagely end the most innocent of lives. Some studies suggest that it is not the mental illness at the forefront of the homicidal act, but rather the conditions of motherhood and the expectations laid upon her. Across time and place, cultures, and all demographics, this crime has happened and continues to exist. It is not one group's issue or concern. However, the ways in which this crime is viewed and treated under the law is drastically different outside of much of the United States. The U.S. in particular, but like many other Western countries, has a tendency to ignore mental health and chooses to not understand, much less be invested in the mental health of mothers. Many nations around the world have specific maternal filicide statutes, which recognize the extent to which this crime is distinct from ordinary homicide. They explicitly diminish the severity of punishment for women who kill their children. U.S. jurisdictions lack such statutes, and maternal filicide is prosecuted under standard homicide laws. The result has been a tendency towards treating each maternal filicide case as exceptional, rather than recognizing the patterns that link these cases and the extent to which these crimes are linked to the social expectations from others. And too often, the media plays a powerful role in dictating how the defendant is framed and even in determining how these cases are resolved. The result is that U.S. maternal filicide case law is incoherent and often arbitrary. Women convicted of substantially equivalent crimes, such as neonaticide, receive sentences that can vary from probation with counseling to life imprisonment without parole. The inconsistencies in sentencing demonstrated by the U.S. criminal justice system is very disturbing. There is the potential for injustice in specific cases, but also the U.S. criminal justice system tends to either over-prosecute to the fullest extent of the law or not convict the offender at all. Unlike the United States, which penalizes filicide similar to other murders, several countries have infanticide laws that recognize the unique circumstances that exist around the crime. Specifically, the killing of children who are under 1 year old. These nations seek to acknowledge and address the correlation between childbirth and mental disturbance in some women. This is a reflection of their concern and understanding of the mental state of women who suffer from postpartum depression that research shows can lead to psychosis. For example, in England, which is one of 20 European countries that have infanticide laws, they passed the Infanticide Acts of 1922 and 1938, which recognize how the severe impact of childbirth has on the mental health of a woman. And it helps to provide a partial defense to murder in such criminal cases. Before this legislation, any woman who killed her child was subjected to the laws dictated by all murder, which at that time would have mandated the death penalty. Similar legislation exists in Wales, Ireland, Canada, and regions of Australia. They promote more humane treatment and focus on providing psychiatric care for women who kill their young children over giving them harsh criminal penalties. Hong Kong has mirrored the Infanticide Acts in England, which provide more lenient punishment towards women who murder their infants, if it can be shown that at the time their mental state was disturbed. Part of the problem in how the United States handles such cases and its offenders is that they are dependent upon the insanity defense, since perinatal illness or postpartum psychosis is not identified under the DSM as a legitimate diagnosis. This leads offenders of maternal filicide to declare a state of insanity, which is not easy to prove. A judge has the power to bar the mention of mental health in a court proceedings, but it does depend on several different factors. First, the specific context of the case is taken into consideration. Second, any relevant laws and rules of evidence must be considered. Lastly, the assessment of the facts and circumstances revolving around the crime. A judge may deem it as being relevant in cases when mental impairment for the defense has been acknowledged or in competency evaluations. However, a judge can limit or eliminate its use altogether in court if they consider it to be irrelevant, unfairly prejudicial, or if it fails to be probative. For example, in Arizona case law, a judge may restrict the diagnosis of a personality disorder as a basis for mitigating circumstances in a criminal trial. In the case of Yui Inoue in Tempe, Arizona, the parameters of using insanity as a defense have become increasingly more difficult and complicated in the last few decades. In 1993, the not guilty by reason of insanity law was replaced by guilty except insane, also known as GEI. This amended the M'Naghten test to require that at the time of the offense, the person had a mental disease or defect, and the person did not know the criminal act was wrong. This further changed the law to exclude GEI as a result of acute voluntary intoxication, character defects, psychosexual or impulse control disorders, and temporary conditions arising from the pressure of the circumstance. If an offense is determined to be serious, the acquittee would be committed to the jurisdiction of the Arizona Psychiatric Security Review Board for a term equal to the sentence that they would have received if found guilty under the Arizona Criminal Code. If it is determined that the person still needed involuntary treatment, they could be held further under civil commitment statutes. In 2004, a report surfaced that explained how valuable space and resources were being wasted at hospitals for the mentally insane to house individuals who were no longer receiving psychiatric care there, but who were still considered to be dangerous. This resulted in a major change in 2007, which required judges to sentence individuals who were found guilty by reason of insanity to a term of incarceration before committing them to the jurisdiction of the Psychiatric Security Review Board for the term of their sentence. It is then up to this review board to determine if and when the individual's treatment has been successful, or if they need ongoing care, or if they are deemed dangerous and considered likely to reoffend. In 2007, new legislation was introduced that allowed for the courts to send some offenders who were found guilty but mentally ill to prison rather than to hospitals for psychiatric care. What this essentially equates to is that it doesn't matter whether you are found to be mentally ill in an Arizona criminal court. That doesn't mean you won't go to prison. Now, if someone is found to be mentally incompetent to stand trial, then that is a different matter altogether. In the case of Yui Inoue, since she was found to be mentally competent, the severity of her mental illness was not even considered a factor in the killing of her children. The defendant had a recorded history of psychiatric care, and it would be next to impossible to deny that she was mentally unstable. I was surprised to learn how the judge had decided to prohibit the mention of her mental health during the court proceedings. Yui Inoue's mental health, in combination with other stressors, was likely what helped to trigger her violence. In no way does it change the crimes she committed, but it may have changed what kind of penalty she received, which I presume is exactly why the judge elected not to allow any mention of it in the trial. In the case of Yui Inoue, she was committed to a psychiatric hospital twice in the months before she killed her children. There was documented proof of her volatile and erratic behavior. The mother was actively under investigation by DCS. Yet on the night of the murders, neither her ex-husband nor the police failed to see any reason for concern regarding the welfare of her children. She had threatened to stab her ex-husband and attacked his items with a meat cleaver. But there was no evidence of potential violence. Their decision to leave the children there is anything but logical, much less responsible to me. I'm tired of hearing about how the child welfare system in this country keeps failing to protect kids from harm, when there were obvious signs of their mother's mental illness. No one except for Yui Inoue is responsible for these atrocious crimes, whether her mental illness played a part or not. But I can't help but think that there were so many signs of her snapping that should not have been dismissed. What stands out to me in this case and the offender's subsequent punishment is how Yui Inoue was perceived and handled by the courts and the media when compared to similar offenders. There have been many other cases of maternal filicide in which the perpetrators inflicted unimaginable, brutal violence and terror upon their young children. Cases that also showed evidence of premeditation and whose perpetrators' mental health history involved hallucinogenic commands telling them to kill their kids. Yet this information was not only included in their criminal trials, but ultimately helped them win their insanity pleas. Deanna Laney, whom I have covered in my podcast, and of course the infamous Andrea Yates, were found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to psychiatric care. Their vicious attack on their small innocent children was perceived to be altruistic, since they believed God had commanded them to kill their children. The first one I mentioned, who is now walking around freely, mind you. So what are the glaring, obvious differences between these women and a mother who kills her children, like Yui Inoue? First of all, Deanna Laney and Andrea Yates were both white, devoutly Christian women who homeschooled their children and who were known as being the most loving and pure-hearted of mothers. Yui Inoue was a stranger to the United States. It is not known how long the family had lived in the area or even the country, but she barely spoke English. Her husband, in contrast, worked at a bank in the area, so it appears that he was adapting fine to living in a new place. I can't help but think her being a Japanese immigrant made it next to impossible for the judge and the jury to relate to her on any level. It was easier for everyone involved to label her as a monster and throw away the key. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Yui Inoue deserves to be locked up for life and not experience any level of happiness, much less comfort. But I can't help but notice how these white, married Christian women who were suffering from the same severity of mental illness as Yui Inoue was, had their crimes perceived as a result of their sickness and were not portrayed as evil monsters. Was Yui Inoue an evil monster? No one can deny that her actions were indicative of evil. But how can a judge deny how severely sick she was to commit such an act against her children? Even if that doesn't mean she spends any time in a psychiatric care hospital, shouldn't there be treatment so she doesn't cause future harm to those around her in prison? The Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 60% of individuals in jail, 49% of state prisoners, and 40% of convicted offenders in federal prison show signs or symptoms of a mental health disorder. Yet our country and its criminal justice system fails to prioritize mental health of offenders and in general help prevent the harm and violence triggered by mental illness. This specific type of murder is so important to gain further insight on because a quarter of women who are admitted to psychiatric care have children under 5 years old. It is also important to study women who commit maternal filicide who are not mentally ill, particularly women who lack education, are young, impoverished, and neglect their prenatal care. One study of mothers of colicky infants who were not diagnosed as mentally ill discovered that as high as 70% of the women had explicit, aggressive thoughts towards their babies, and 26% of them had thoughts of killing them during an episode. To help prevent this horrendous crime, understanding these thoughts and characteristics of mothers who may be more prone to acting upon these feelings than others is critical. It may help to identify mothers who are at high risk of killing their children. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has developed the National Violent Death Reporting System, which collects data about violent deaths, including homicides, suicides, and deaths that occur by law enforcement in the active duty. They systematically gather information from medical examiner reports, law enforcement, and death certificates and place them into an anonymous database. The system pools more than 600 unique data elements to help paint a clearer, more detailed picture of what may have caused these deaths. Everything from relationship problems, mental health conditions, toxicology reports, to life stressors such as known financial issues, employment problems, or physical related problems, are all collected to provide valuable context into the individual's death. The CDC uses this data to develop, implement, and evaluate programs and strategies to help prevent violence. All 50 states, as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, submit this data to the NVDRS. Even more relevant to this case is how the U.S. FBI has established a project that examines data for a large sample of women who have killed their children. All 50 states also have implemented child fatality review teams, but unfortunately, these individuals' deaths are often not investigated until after a person has been prosecuted, due to restrictions to access on law enforcement and coroner reports. These cases of murder are unbearable. They are difficult to listen to and emotionally draining to cover. Countless podcasts stay clear of covering such family violence. These crimes are beyond horrifying and disturbing. Our society doesn't want to think about a parent killing a child, but the only way to ever prevent these crimes is to acknowledge their existence and discuss these cases. At the children's former school, Kyrene del Cielo in Tempe, they have memorialized Mia and Kai Inoue, so their impact is forever remembered. In a beautiful mural, the children are painted outside amongst the trees. Mia is depicted with many cats, whom she adored, and Kai in his red sneakers, which he always wore. No matter what clothes he had on. Their former principal spoke about how these two children were adored at the school. Everyone loved them. They were two of the kindest, brightest, and most polite kids she had the privilege of ever knowing. They both loved art class, and some of their paintings hang near the mural. They are vivid, creative, and bright, just as the children were known for being during their short-lived lives. Thank you so much for listening to this heartbreaking story of Mia and Kai Inoue of Tempe, Arizona. Please let me know your thoughts on this case. I know it was a very difficult one to hear. But these stories are so important to be told. We can't, as a society, afford to just bury our heads in the sand, so to speak, and not talk about the most horrific of cases. Until next time, be safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Lita Caldwell. Original music Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.